At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches Episode 8. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 120 Yuta. September 12, 1946 homeroom. They say a bad parent was traumatized as a child. Yuta scoffed with disbelief every time he heard that quote. Wouldn't a traumatized child who grew up to be a parent themselves avoid engaging in the same acts that hurt them as a child? Wouldn't they realize that their parents were wrong for committing such atrocities to them, and choose to treat their child how they wanted to be treated back then? The truth is, they wouldn't, because they are a bad parent after all. Yuta swore to himself that he would greet his future child with love and affection every morning before they left for school. As Yuta walked into homeroom, the events of this morning wouldn't leave his mind. Although a smile was plastered on his face, his heart was numb. The fresh feeling of his head slamming against the hard table lingered, and he placed a bandage on his forehead to hide the bruise. The memory of his father gripping the ends of his black hair, and the bluish tones that surrounded his vision occurred so often that the image looked the same to Yuta. He recalled letting it get to him, crying every night and wiping the tears in the morning, allowing the abuse to seep into the crevices of his hollow heart, which caused him to say cruel words to Carter last week. Then he reevaluated his actions. He told himself that he would not let the lack of fatherly love drain him anymore. For as long as he could remember, it fatigued him. Now, as he walked into the gray classroom of room 110 with a content smile on his face, he sat in his seat next to his favorite people in the world. They were his light in the darkness. They were his hope for the future. They were his family. Hi-de-ho, Carter. Yuta giddily greeted as he plopped onto his seat. I wanted to ask if we do not skip swim practice today. I'm enjoying the swim team and the fellas. They're so much fun, he said, shifting his position so that he was facing Carter. I know the after-school meetings are urgent and have to take place straight after school sometimes, but I miss swimming with you, Yuta explained, biting his lip shyly. Carter didn't respond. He gazed at the book on his desk and tried his best to avoid eye contact with Yuta. Yuta raised his eyebrow but didn't question it. He assumed Carter was listening. Oh, he suddenly exclaimed. I forgot that today is Wednesday, so there's no after-school meeting. It's just the leadership club with Mr. Stevenson, and it will only take up 1 hour after school, so we have time for our other clubs. Yuta laughed at his forgetfulness and ruffled his black hair sheepishly. Yuta recently began enjoying the school days. For 8 hours he was away from home, plus an extra 2 hours of after-school club activities, which consisted of swimming with Carter and investigating the paranormal mystery with his other friends. Anywhere was better than home, he came to realize at a young age. Carter bounced his feet anxiously and continued ignoring Yuta. Yuta twiddled his thumbs as he patiently waited for the white-haired boy to respond. Carter was usually quick to chat with Yuta during the classes they had together, especially during homeroom when there was a lot of free time. It was because of Carter's willingness to talk to Yuta that he was able to gradually open up to him. Carter's energy sucked Yuta in so much that at times he forgot about the haunting day that was etched in his mind since he was a child. For once in his life, he was able to tolerate his father in the mornings, because he knew that if he successfully passed him he would be able to go to school, where his real family was. He peered at the unexpectedly silent Carter and furrowed his eyebrows, dumbfounded. Carter, is something wrong? Why aren't you talking to me? He frantically asked with a worried expression. Carter sighed and reached into his pencil case. He grabbed a pen and began writing in his book, still ignoring Yuta's question. Yuta's heart sunk to the depths of a bottomless pool as he watched Carter dismiss his presence. It brought back memories Yuta didn't want to think about right now. Did I do something wrong, Carter? Yuta asked, his voice soft with apprehensiveness. He knew this feeling too well. The ugly feeling that people who he thought were his friends suddenly ignoring him the next day resided in Yuta for years. This resulted in him feeling that he shouldn't talk, for the fear that he'll hear their scornful remarks again. It's only a matter of time before he does that to me, Yuta hopelessly thought. He wiped the brimming tears and turned away from Carter when he didn't respond. Yuta leaned forward and politely tapped Jessica's shoulder. She was sitting in front of him, and Yuta wanted to make sure that she too wasn't suddenly ignoring her. "Jess, how are you?" he asked in a pained voice that he masked with forced cheerfulness. Jessica didn't turn around or respond either. Yuta's fragile soul shattered into a million pieces as he lowered his quivering arms. He bit his lip and called out to her again, hoping that it was just a misunderstanding. "Jess." His voice barely whispered. There was no response from her again, and it felt like Yuta was talking to a wall. "No. Did they change their minds and think I'm the one? But Carter told me that he believed me." The fact that his two best friends weren't talking to him may seem insignificant to others, but to Yuta, it felt like the end of the world. Yuta spun around and frantically tapped Jimmy's desk, as he was sitting behind him. "Jimmy, I. He quickly thought of something to get Jimmy's attention. "I think the chess club is great." No response came from Jimmy either. He continued flipping through his notebook as if Yuta was a small fly that he was too busy to be bothered about. Never in his life did he have any friends to talk to before he arrived at Willesden. It was ethereal the way Carter and Jessica would never snicker behind his back or smack his head roughly. Neither would the others, although they had their differences. Yuta always thought of them as good people. Even if they suspected him, he knew they meant well and weren't just doing it for the sake of wanting to hurt him. They had a reason. Perhaps if the paranormal activity wasn't occurring, they would be good friends. He realized a long time ago that in this life, he would never be more than a ping-pong ball, bouncing from one person to another in hopes that someone would give him love. He gave his love for free, but it seemed that the others always wanted to place a cage around it and limit its expression. His father demanded that he show his love for him by demeaning his son, and so the damage set in softly at first. But as with a harsh tide doesn't the beach erode. After the silent homeroom class was over, Yuta rushed out the door and tried catching up with the group. They were all walking out together and purposely left him behind. Yuta decided to take a stance and do something about this situation. Last year he was too weak and insecure to stand up to his bullies. This year he was different. Now he knew what it felt like to be loved in return, and he wasn't going to let that feeling slip away without a fight. "Hey!" he shouted in the middle of the hallway. Carter and the others stopped in their tracks for a moment, and they were about to turn around, but Jimmy placed a hand on their shoulders and whispered something. Yuta frustratingly sped towards the group and grabbed the back of Carter and Jimmy's shirts, and turned them around to face him. This caught the attention of the others, and finally, they noticed his existence. "What the hell? Why are none of you bastards talking to me? What wrong did I do?" he snapped, his black eyes drilling fiercely into them. "Is it because you think I'm the one? I thought you don't suspect me anymore after that test we did." He exploded, staring intensely at his friends. Their expressions weren't deadpan or upset at him for bothering them. Rather, they looked sorry. Carter and Jessica looked like that, at least. Barbara and Olivia were staring at the ground. Josh and Ronald had their arms crossed as they listened intently, and Jimmy stood in the middle, analyzing Yuta's every action. Yuta didn't know what to think about them looking guilty. Should he stop and let them explain? No. I have to keep going and tell them how I feel. I can't lose them. Yuta's eyes glazed with fire as he hissed his next words. He reminded himself of how no response came from his friends this morning, which helped him feel angry and irritated. "Do you think that I'd waste my time by somehow conjuring this paranormal shit and attack all of you?" Yuta yelled as his blood boiled. He clenched his fist and shook his head frantically. "The answer is I would never. 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 I don't want to hurt you because you're my. His voice abruptly choked and he gulped before proceeding. "You're my friends. My only friends. I know most of you don't get along with each other, but I like all of you. I don't want to lose you." Yuta paused for a second to inhale deeply. It suddenly dawned on him that perhaps they figured out his secret and were turning on him. He furrowed his eyebrows determinedly and said everything he could to make them believe he was not the one, despite how it seemed. Yuta even had to reassure himself that the day he created that strange white light and was being chased by the figure didn't line up with the beginning of the paranormal activity his friends experienced. That has no correlation at all, right? It doesn't matter to me whether you feel the same way. All I want from you is trust. I want you to trust me because I trust you all. He bit his lips as he scanned their stunned expressions. They had not expected he would say that. "Look," he yelled, outstretching his hands and facing his clear palms to the silent group. "Look all over my body for a mark or any sign. I promise you there's none. What's all this ruckus going on here?" "Mr. Stevenson said, his head suddenly popping out of his classroom. It was at that moment the group realized they had been standing next to his door, and Yuta was causing a disturbance. Yuta sighed and bit his lip. "Mr. Stevenson, I'm sorry. I was just yelling at them because—" He trailed off and stared at his feet, deciding it was best not to finish his sentence. "Never mind." Mr. Stevenson kindly nodded. "Well, you should all get to your classes quickly. Argue somewhere else," he said, chuckling at his joke. No one was in the mood for laughing with him. He turned around to leave, but Yuta suddenly thought of something. "Wait, Mr. Stevenson," Yuta said, looking up at his teacher. "Tell me, what does it take to be a leader?" Mr. Stevenson grinned, eager to talk about leadership. He was the supervisor of their unofficial club after all. "Well, I'm glad you asked, Yuta. To be a good leader, you will have to set a good example for others to follow. That is where your empathy, integrity, and trust come into play. Good communication skills and decision-making capabilities also play a vital role in the success of a leader." Yuta nodded his head as the others listened keenly. Empathy. A leader must be empathic towards their team. How else are we going to build a connection with one another? He said, looking directly at Josh and Ronald as he spoke. Integrity. How can you expect your followers to be honest with you if you're not honest yourself? He pointed out, turning his head to look at Jimmy and Carter. Trust. We must be transparent and believe each other when we say something. We can't betray and turn our backs on each other. He exclaimed, looking at the girls. We all have the same goal, and if we want to achieve it, we must work together. He passionately yelled at the last part of his speech. Behind Yuta, Mr. Stevenson stood with a raised eyebrow, confused at what was going on. Being a leader means we have to take a step forward together. How can we call ourselves leaders when we can't stand in a room without suspecting each other for a second? His friends looked at him with wide eyes as silence pooled the entire school. Yuta quietly panted, feeling out of breath after all the yelling. However, he kept a fierce gaze on the group, prepared to argue back if they responded with a counterattack. Carter was the first one to respond, breaking the momentary silence. It was all Jimmy's fault. He desperately shouted, pointing at the short boy beside him. It was his idea. He wanted us to test you by telling us not to talk to you for an entire day so he could monitor your behavior. Carter explained, stepping towards Yuta with apologetic eyes. I didn't want to do it. It was so difficult. Yuta blinked, a dumbfounded expression on his face. What? He squeaked, baffled and flustered. Jimmy sighed. Sorry, Yuta, if that hurt your feelings. I only told them to do it because I needed to know. He gave Yuta a secretive look that read, if you're the 1 foot, because he couldn't say it out loud with Mr. Stevenson next to them. If it makes you feel better, you passed the test, Jimmy added with a light-hearted shrug. Yuta winced and lowered his clenched fists. He opened and closed his mouth repeatedly, with surprise etched all over his face. So, you don't suspect me anymore? Jimmy shook his head. I'm going to keep a close eye on you just in case, however, you're right. We should trust each other. From now on, Yuta, I believe ya, he nobly said, his hazel eyes glimmering. Besides, if it weren't for ya and those after-school meetings, I wouldn't have found happiness with y'all either. Does this mean? Yuta paused for a moment, looking around at his friends. Does this mean you don't hate me? He asked for confirmation. Jessica shook her head and gave Yuta a genuine smile. We never hated you, Yuta, she said, her blue eyes glittering as she stepped towards him. Yuta smiled softly, although the sensitive boy still needed further reassurance. You don't think I'm a bother? Josh scoffed sardonically. No, but you're not even my friend. That was about as sincere as Josh would get, and Yuta understood that. Josh, Mr. Stevenson sternly interjected. No. He disappointingly shook his head, signaling him to be respectful. Josh bit his lip and looked down, slightly embarrassed that his favorite teacher was talking to him like that. Yuta nodded his head, sighing with reprieve. A timid smile appeared on his face as relief washed over him like a refreshing wave. cooling his tempered body. So they haven't figured out the truth. Oh, so I can walk with you to class? He hopefully asked. Carter grinned and patted his shoulder. Of course. Let's go, we have much to discuss. As they turned around to leave, Yuta happily shuffled after them. He felt relieved that it ended up being nothing significant, although he was still slightly flustered over the fact that he yelled at them and said embarrassing things. He glanced over his shoulder at Mr. Stevenson, who was leaning against his door with a proud grin on his face. Yuta assumed he was happy that his students were getting along. Mr. Stevenson. Thanks for your help, Yuta said, giving him a sincere smile. Mr. Stevenson nodded his head and beamed at Yuta. Good job, Yuta. You have excellent leadership qualities, Mr. Stevenson complimented, and Yuta's eyes lit up. He knew that Mr. Stevenson truly meant that comment, and it delighted the boy. It brightened his entire world, and suddenly Willesden felt like home for him again. Yuta waved goodbye to his favorite teacher and trotted towards his friends as they walked down the hall. Wait! Mr. Stevenson suddenly called out to them, as an idea had popped in his head. He approached the students and gave them a huge smile as they turned around. Since I am not only your teacher, but also your leadership club supervisor, I want to give you an activity to do during lunch that will strengthen your trust and teamwork. Yuta exchanged glances with his friends and they eagerly nodded. Sure. What is it? He asked. Basketball. Mr. Stevenson blew his whistle. It rang throughout the gymnasium and signaled the students to begin playing. Yuta was on Team B with Jessica, Ronald, and Barbara. He wanted to be with Carter, but he was on Team A with Josh, Olivia, and Jimmy. Ronald stood in the middle of the court, standing off against Josh. They placed their palms on their grubby knees and prepared to grab the ball for their team, both with fierce glares on their faces. Stop acting like I'm your enemy for everything, Josh, Ronald said, brazenly staring at Josh. I don't hate you, even after what you did. Josh scoffed and rolled his eyes. You're always my enemy, he spat as his emerald green eyes narrowed and pierced Ronald. Mr. Stevenson threw the basketball in the air at the midcourt line. Josh swiftly jumped up to grab it and it was deemed his team's ball. Yuta reassuringly patted Ronald's back as he quickly ran towards Josh. His football rival began dribbling the ball down the court, refusing to pass to his teammates, and trying to make the point himself. Ronald caught up to Josh's long strides and they fought for the ball. Ronald pivoted to the right, Josh pivoted to the left, Ronald scooted to the left, Josh scooted to the right. Finally, after a swift shove by Ronald, he managed to snatch the ball from Josh. Hey, you can't just take the ball from me, Josh yelled, violently smacking his back. Ronald scrambled up and continued dribbling the ball that was still in his hands. How else is the game going to progress? He pointed out with a proud grin spread across his face. Mr. Stevenson blew his whistle. Josh, I will not condone shoving to occur on school property, he sternly yelled from the sidelines. Yuta laughed at Josh's flustered expression and smiled at Mr. Stevenson, who tipped his red cap towards him. Ronald abruptly passed the ball towards Yuta. Yuta barely caught the ball, as he was not expecting it, although he was glad Ronald had the decency to pass to his teammates. He stood still in the middle of the court, not knowing what to do even though Mr. Stevenson explained the rules to them beforehand. He remembered playing basketball in his old school, and he enjoyed the sport, but never really knew how to play it. He mumbled, looking around the court to find a teammate he could pass to. What the hell? He's holding the ball for too long, Josh furiously yelled, the veins on his forehead tightening with frustration. Stop traveling. Jessica cheerfully clapped her hands. You can do it, Yuta. Pass to me, she exclaimed, waving to Yuta from across the court. That's the spirit, Jessica. Mr. Stevenson said, a look of amusement on his face, as he watched his students attempt to work together as a team. Learn something from her, Josh. Yuta nodded his head and clumsily threw the ball towards Jessica. She had her arms wide open, but when the ball came zooming towards her, she screeched and recoiled, guarding her face with her arms. The ball bounced off her arms and Carter swiftly dove to grab the ball before it hit the ground. All right, Carter. Jimmy ecstatically cheered, jumping up and down. Carter grinned and puffed his chest out proudly. He stuck his tongue out at Josh, his teammate. That's why I have a silver medal. He gloated triumphantly. Yuta rushed towards Carter and stood in front of him, his eyes wide with ambrosial and his tender lips pouting cutely. "Carter, can I have the ball?" he softly requested, outstretching his hands. Carter blinked rapidly and a blush appeared on his cheeks. "Okay," he said after barely a moment of hesitation. Carter gently handed the ball to him, violating so many rules in 1 second that Yuta could sense Josh's blood boiling from across the court. However, Yuta knew that Carter would do anything he asked of him, even if they were on opposite teams and it broke the rules. Josh grabbed Carter's hair and started pulling at it furiously, adding a few punches here and there. "You idiot! You bastard! You mister!" Stevenson sternly blew his whistle before Josh could finish. "Josh, I will not condone cussing to occur on school property." Ronald slapped Yuta's back, impressed with the aloof boy's cunning tactic. "Good job, Yuta," he said, laughing at Josh's demise. Yuta looked up at him and smiled gleefully as his heart surged with content. This school and his world might be falling apart with every passing second, but he finally found love and not a thing or a person could ever take that away. The tall people that passed him didn't scare him any longer, and he hoped that one day they would see the world through love's eyes as he currently is. The air was sweet and there was no worry. His world had been cast anew and he was savoring every moment. Yuta passed the ball to Jessica once he arrived at the free throw line. This time she successfully grabbed it midair. She bounced excitedly and Yuta applauded her. "Shoot it, Jess," he said, hoping Jessica would make the hoop. Jessica nodded her head and everyone crowded the three-point arc, waiting for her to shoot the ball. Yuta bit his lip as adrenaline pumped through his veins, watching Jessica with encouraging eyes. Jessica aimed the ball upwards and it didn't even touch the basketball net. Her shoot was far from a perfect curve and resembled the shape of a limp noodle. "I'm going to kill myself. And she isn't even on my team," Josh muttered to himself, placing a hand over his forehead. It was clear that he thought of himself as the only good player on the court. "Don't worry, Jess. You'll get it next time," Yuta assured her, raising both of his hands and giving her an encouraging high five. On the other side of the court, Olivia stood with her arms crossed, refusing to play. She walked aimlessly around the court and looked down at the ground. Yuta observed that recently she has been strangely quiet, but he paid it no mind. "Mr. Stevenson noticed her lack of participation too and called out to her. "Olivia, show some enthusiasm." Olivia gave her teacher a scornful glare. "What do you want me to do?" "Jazz hands," she said, mockingly splaying her fingers and waving them in the air. The students continued playing and a noticeable trend could be seen. Josh and Ronald were too into the game and played aggressively. Carter and Yuta didn't take it too seriously but they were still enjoying it and participating actively. Barbara and Jessica tried their best and held the ball a couple of times, but they were quite clumsy. However, it seemed that they were having fun. Yuta smiled at Jessica, proud to see that her expression was no longer gloomy. Olivia continued wandering around the court, not even attempting to participate, and no one bothered her. Finally, Jimmy was simply too short to contribute anything significant to the game. Despite that, the group of students all wore radiant smiles. Their energy spilled out just as much as the drinks in their cups, and every other noise was their laughter. It was as if fun was printed in their DNA. And all it took was a basketball game and a dash of happiness to bring that out. Even Mr. Stevenson was having fun. He would shake his head and say kids every time they misbehaved, but always there was a twitch of a smile. It was as if their exuberance reminded him of what it was like to be young. Mr. Stevenson abruptly blew his silver whistle and called for the entire group. They answered his call and came rushing forward. "Folks, I want to see more cooperation and teamwork," Mr. Stevenson said to the gathering surrounding him. "Talk to each other, discuss strategies, and pass the ball to your teammates, Mr. Stevenson said, zipping up the red varsity windbreaker that he decided to wear to be in basketball spirit, as he so excitedly put it. "I'm looking at you, Josh." Carter tauntingly laughed right in Josh's face. "Mr. Stevenson, you're right. I think you should disqualify him." Josh grumbled something under his breath. It was smart of him to not say whatever swear word it was out loud. Instead, he clasped his hands together and looked up at Mr. Stevenson. "Don't disqualify me, Mr. Stevenson. I promise I'll be a better team player. he pleaded, although Yuta couldn't tell whether he was bluffing or not for the sake of gaining his favorite teacher's approval. Mr. Stevenson chuckled and shook his head. Of course not, Josh. Disqualifying you would be unfair. Plus, you remind me of my high school basketball years. However, I am going to have to teach you all about sportsmanship and how that ties in with leadership, all right? He said, pointing at the blackboard hanging up on the gym wall. First, I want you to remember that the opposite team is not your enemy. They are simply hurdles you must jump over. He enthusiastically began. After Mr. Stevenson's pep talk, Team B huddled together on their side of the court. All right, what's the plan, folks? Ronald questioned, peering at his giddy teammates. Yuta thought for a moment. Then a grin spread across his face when a strategy popped into his head. Why don't we? On the other side of the court, Team A stared scornfully at the other team. They're so cheerful for no reason. Don't they understand that this game is life and death? Carter exclaimed, his arms crossed as he stood next to Josh. Josh snorted. Look at them huddling. We should do the same, so we don't look lame in front of Stevenson, he remarked. The boys on the other side nodded their heads and wrapped their arms around each other's shoulder. Olivia, come? Josh shouted, grabbing her shoulder and forcefully pulling her into the huddle. Don't touch me, she abruptly yelled, stepping backwards. Her body was trembling at Josh's and Jimmy's touch, and she violently swatted them away. The boys shared a stunned and confused glance, before shrugging and coming up with a plan on their own. Mr. Stevenson blew his whistle once again, signaling a new game. Let's do it right this time, he shouted as everyone stood in their positions and prepared for the first real round. This time Yuta and Carter were standing off against each other. Carter crouched in his spot at the left wing, and on the right wing Yuta immediately copied him, attempting to look fierce in front of the other team. Mr. Stevenson threw the ball in the air, and Yuta jumped up to grab it. Too slow, Carter, he excitedly shouted, dribbling past him. He was starting to get used to the rules as adrenaline rushed through him. This is fun. Damn you, Carter grunted. He attempted to catch Yuta off guard by grabbing the ball from his left side, but Yuta swiftly blocked him by pivoting to the right and raising an arm. Over here, Yuta, he heard Jessica's jolly voice shout. Yuta looked up and grinned as beads of sweat dripped down his forehead. He tossed the ball to her as he sprinted across the court, and she gripped it tightly. Jessica traveled down the court and easily passed by her obstacle, Olivia. Olivia stood in the middle of the court, motionless, and she didn't even put up a fight for the ball. Barbara, Jessica shouted, tossing the ball to Barbara's open hands. Barbara barely caught the ball, and for a second Yuta thought she was going to drop it and their plan was going to go to waste. Thankfully, she didn't and was now comfortably dribbling the ball around Jimmy. Jimmy flailed his arms stupidly, underestimating Barbara's coordination. Barbara successfully passed by him and tossed the ball to Ronald, Team B's golden ticket. The #1 most athletic person on Team B caught the flying ball. His hurdle was Josh, whose greedy green eyes were desperate to win. Ronald dribbled around him and Josh's long arms almost slammed the ball out of his hands. Ronald blocked him by facing his back towards him and swiftly launching his long lean legs into the air. As the boy spun in the air, time seemed to slow. Finally, after what felt like long minutes, Ronald succeeded in his slam dunk. Ronald! 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 Yuta and the rest of Team B cheered, jumping in the air and hugging Ronald. Ronald laughed and embraced his team. Elated smiles were spread on all their faces. It was a moment Yuta would cherish forever. Now that's what I call excellent teamwork and spirit, Mr. Stevenson cheered, waving his red cap excitedly in the air. He approached Team B and gave them all ecstatic high fives. On the left side of the court, Team A looked down on their opponents. Carter clicked his tongue with disdain. Man, it was bold of Stevenson to put all the people who hate losing in one team. He muttered, with a glaring look in his eyes. Josh snorted in agreement. Our revenge will be sweet, he simply stated, a jeering grin plastered on his face. Team A suddenly had a sense of fiery motivation to work together and score a point against Team B. Losing didn't bring them down, it brought them up. Yeah. Plus, we each have gold medals in sports. Jimmy uselessly chimed in. Except Carter, of course. The group turned to give Jimmy an inferior look. You ruined the moment, Josh angrily spat, rolling his eyes. Yuta clutched the orange basketball in his hands with a wide grin as he called to the other team. Is team ready for round 2? He excitedly yelled, dribbling the ball in as much of an intimidating manner as possible. Teammate, it's Team Carter. Carter retorted, placing his hands on his hips. When only a groan came from Josh, Carter realized the stupidity of his statement. You guys don't like Team Carter. Fine, teammate is. You're all cold fish. In the end, Team A lost. At least you folks in Team A tried your best. I saw how fired up you all were. That's the kind of energy we need here at Willesden, Mr. Stevenson encouragingly said, rubbing Josh's hunched back. He gave his teacher a grouchy look and hopelessly nodded. Yuta could tell Ronald enjoyed watching Josh lose for once since he did too. Mr. Stevenson, we did great too, right? Yuta joyfully asked, wrapping his arms around the basketball and bringing it to his chest. Mr. Stevenson grinned. Of course. Team A did wonderfully. It's not about the fact that you won, it's about how well you worked together. He earnestly replied, ruffling Yuta's head affectionately. Yuta merrily laughed and bobbed his head up and down, like a child enjoying his father's loving embrace. After a water break, Mr. Stevenson gathered his students in the middle of the court. Since we have some time left before lunch ends, I have another team activity for you all to do, he said, a sparkle flickering in his emerald green eyes. Josh light-heartedly groaned. Can't we just play another round of basketball? I like playing it. He whined, pausing abruptly in the middle of his sentence. Yuta had always believed Josh was a football fanatic and only thought of that sport all day. But it seemed he found a new interest. I suppose everyone found something new today. Mr. Stevenson chuckled. Perhaps another day, Josh. I have noticed a drastic improvement in all of your teamwork and sportsmanship, however. There is still a lot you folks need to improve on. This next task will help with that, Mr. Stevenson said, looking around at the students' beaming faces. I want the boys and girls to separate, sit in a circle and simply hold a pleasant conversation for 5 minutes. I will give you a topic. This task will help improve your collaboration skills, something I've noticed has been a major problem during our club meetings, he explained, standing up and grabbing chairs from the equipment room. Once the students were seated, Yuta peered over at the girls' group. It consisted of only Jessica, Olivia, and Barbara. Yuta wondered how awkward it must be for Jessica to be forced to hold a conversation with Olivia. All Yuta knew was that their relationship became a little rocky after their meeting the other day. He still had yet to hear from Jessica about whether or not they officially broke their friendship yet. He shifted his gaze towards the boys circled him. Carter sat across from him and they shared a smile, enjoying this special day. Ronald sat beside Yuta on his right while Josh was on his left. Jimmy was between Ronald and Carter, and a finger was stuffed up his nose like always. Yuta suddenly realized how grateful he was about the fact that Jimmy didn't touch the ball during the game. Folks, your first topic is to say one thing you like about each person in your group, Mr. Stevenson piped up. He blew his whistle to signal the start of their conversations, and Yuta chuckled to himself about how this activity amused Mr. Stevenson. His teacher was outgoing and bubbly as usual, but he seemed to genuinely enjoy hanging out with his students in a new environment. The other boys stared at Mr. Stevenson with surprise. Come on, Mr. Stevenson. That's too much to ask for, Jimmy disputed, and for once the other boys agreed with him. You know we all hate each other. No, you don't hate each other. You think that, but truly it is an illusion your mind has created to make yourself feel better. In actuality, there is at least one thing you admire about each other, Mr. Stevenson firmly stated, his green eyes scanning the boys' pouting expressions. Only one person can speak at a time, and whoever is speaking must hold the basketball. Start. Their teacher exclaimed, blowing the whistle. Yuta turned to look at the boys, and since he already had the basketball in his hands, he decided to speak first. He muttered, deep in thought. He already knew how hard this was going to be. Jimmy, you may be a book beater, but I do admire your intelligence. He started with the easiest one and smiling kindly at Jimmy. Jimmy grinned and adjusted his glasses geekily. Thanks, Yuta, he said, the chunky braces on his teeth gleaming. How smart can a 10-year-old be? Josh abruptly quipped, as he crossed his arms and slumped in his chair. Mr. Stevenson placed a hand on Josh's head as he was standing behind the unruly boy. and listening to their conversation. "Josh, it's not your turn to speak," he said, shaking Josh's light brown hair. Josh huffed and muttered an apology, something Yuta never heard from his mouth. Yuta noticed how Josh seemed to admire Mr. Stevenson, since when he was around, Josh would be as obedient as a pet dog. Mr. Stevenson seemed to reciprocate the admiration as well, as he had been teasing Josh more than the others. Yuta hoped that Mr. Stevenson had space in his heart to give him the same affection. After Yuta finished sharing his compliments with the others, it was time for Carter. Yuta pondered deeply, wanting to make his comment for Carter as meaningful as possible. "Carter, you're excellent at swimming, and I have to thank you for introducing me to the swim team. You're honestly the first amazing friend I've ever had," he said, excitedly grinning. A light pink blush appeared on Carter's cheeks and he averted his gaze. "That's so cheesy," he sheepishly muttered, although his silver eyes sparkled. It was as if the comment pleased him and made his day. Yuta beamed and softly handed the ball to Josh as Mr. Stevenson left to check the girls' conversation. Josh sighed and started with Carter as he bounced the ball around his legs. "Hm. Carter, you're annoying," he bluntly began with a deadpan expression. Josh probably wasn't planning to say that in front of Mr. Stevenson, but now that he left, he could be unquestionably honest. Carter's jaw fell to the ground at the opposite comment Josh made compared to Yuta's. "You're supposed to say what you like about us. I'm telling Stevenson," he exclaimed, widening his eyes with alarm. Josh rolled his eyes and ignored him. "Jimmy, your nose-picking habits are disgusting," he continued with a straight expression, turning to face the boy sitting across him. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Jimmy exclaimed, immediately taking his finger out of his nose. "Yuta." "You're okay," Josh said, turning to look at Yuta, who smiled in response. "Only if I ignore your suspicious behavior," he added, and instantly Yuta pouted, desperately wanting the game to be over. Josh turned to Carter and swiftly chucked the basketball at him. "Your turn, Carter. You didn't say what you like about Ronald, idiot. Or rather, dislike, since you're choosing not to play by the rules as usual," Carter pointed out. "How can I be an idiot if I purposely forgot Ronald?" Josh uselessly retorted. Carter returned the ball to him and Josh sighed. He turned to stare at Ronald, who didn't meet his eyes. The tension suddenly increased in the atmosphere as Josh pondered about what to insult Ronald for. Yuta instinctively clenched his eyes shut, bracing himself for the squabble that was about to occur. "Ronald, I hate you, but you're quite good at football," he mumbled, looking down at his feet. Ronald turned to look at Josh and he raised an eyebrow, wondering if he heard that correctly. "You're even better than me," he continued, and Yuta opened his mouth to tell Josh that he only had to say one thing, but Carter shushed him. "And you're a better leader than me. You should be the captain." He whispered the last comment, still staring at his feet. His comment was so out of character that Ronald just stared at him open-mouthed. His brain formulated no thoughts other than to register that he was dumbfounded. "Oh," was all Ronald could respond with. Everyone else was also quite taken aback by the sudden compliment as their jaws dropped to the floor. Yuta had no idea where that comment came from, but he felt pleased for Ronald. Perhaps this was a beginning of a new friendship between all of them. When both groups finished their first discussion, Mr. Stevenson gave them their second one. "Great job, fellas. I have been listening and noticing a lot of improvement in your collaboration skills. Let's give it our all for the last topic before I allow you to leave." Mr. Stevenson clapped his hands, and the students ecstatically joined with him. "I want you each to discuss one thing you like about the people in the opposite group. Remember, one at a time." Josh giddily turned to look at the boys. "Jimmy, you ought to go first," he said, hurling the basketball at the stunted boy. Jimmy scrambled to catch it properly and his glasses almost slid off his face. "Tell us which one of the girls you carry a torch for," he smugly stated. Jimmy scrunched his nose in confusion. "What do you mean?" Stevenson said. "We're doing the same thing Stevenson said," Josh interrupted, rolling his eyes, just with a little twist. "So who is it, Jimmy? Or are you too scared?" he asked, mocking Jimmy's southern accent. Yuta peered at Jimmy curiously, interested in what the short boy was going to say. "None of them. I don't think about any girl in our class romantically," he strictly said, shifting the glasses that were perched on his germy nose. "The chess club and the thing is my main priority." Josh tilted his head backwards and groaned. Never mind, I understand. Jimmy and Barbara are perfect for each other. End of the story, he said with a taunting grin. Yuta grimaced at the harsh comment, knowing that was too far, even for Josh. Jimmy snorted, seeing through Josh's fabricated nonsense. That's not only insulting to Barbara but also me, he pointed out, tossing the ball to Yuta. What about ya, Yuta? Uhodoya fancy. Yuta darted his eyes back and forth, anxious about the fact that the spotlight was suddenly on him. He had never talked about liking girls with a group of friends before, so he didn't realize how nerve-wracking it was before this. The boys leaned towards him as if they were expecting an interesting answer. Don't know. They're all amazing, he said, shrugging. Josh clicked his tongue, irritated. You fat heads are so boring, he grumbled as leaned towards Yuta. Who do you find attractive? Or if the world was ending and you were forced to share a final heartfelt honeycooler with one of the girls, who would you choose? Josh explained, trying to put the question in perspective so Yuta could give an actual answer. Yuta bit his lip and hummed while he thought of a response. He noticed Carter paying close attention to him, seemingly wanting to know his answer. I suppose Jess, because she and I are close. But Olivia and Barbara are nice people. She doesn't like being called Jess, Ronald interjected. She doesn't even let me call her that. Oh, when I call her Jess she doesn't seem to mind. Yuta shrugged, deciding not to think too deeply about it. Jimmy whistled and hooted. Ronald, how do you feel about that answer? Aren't you dating her? He questioned, eager for a quarrel to unfold between the two boys. Unfortunately for him, Ronald and Yuta remained undaunted. Yeah, we're dating, Ronald said, shrugging. He seemed quite unfazed about it, as if he couldn't care less about the fact that they were dating. Carter arched his eyebrows with puzzlement. I never see you two chatting that much, he pointed out. You two are better off as friends in my opinion. Yuta grinned and handed Ronald the basketball. Is there someone else? He jokingly teased, giving him a playful shove. He slowly realized it was exciting to talk to the boys about something other than the paranormal activity. It had taken such a toll on the young teenagers that they had forgotten what it felt like to be normal high school students. Ronald smoothly spun the basketball on his finger. Actually, I suppose there is, he said nonchalantly. Yuta widened his eyes, not expecting his joke to be true. The boys went wild. What? But you're dating Jessica, Carter exclaimed, flailing his arms in the air like it was the hugest dilemma on the planet. Jimmy nodded his head in agreement, although he was more interested in the girl who stole Ronald's heart. Who do you like? Josh chortled as he leaned back in his chair. See, I told you this game would be fun, he simpered. He was surprisingly calm about Ronald liking another girl, Yuta noted. On any other day, Josh would have told Jessica straight away or aggravate him until he was 6 feet under. Instead, Josh was acting like he knew who the girl was. Don't tell her. Olivia, Ronald said, his lips curving into a smirk. The boys went wild again. What? But she's your girlfriend's best friend, Carter exclaimed, gaping at this information. And have you ever met that girl? She's a rusty hen. They aren't really best friends anymore, Yuta dumbly pointed out, too baffled to say anything else. Jimmy gawked and his big framed glasses almost slid off his slippery nose when he jolted up in his seat. But Olivia and Josh are dating, you fat head. The boys turned to look at Josh to see his reaction. Surprisingly, a smug look was plastered on his face as his arms were dangling around the sides of his chair, in a laid-back manner. Not anymore, he proudly confirmed. What the hell? Since when? Jimmy exclaimed, completely flabbergasted. Missed opportunity, man. Good for you, man, Carter said, nodding his head with approval. He gave Josh a weak applaud as if he did something extraordinary. But Olivia must be feeling so hurt, Yuta pointed out, feeling sorry for the girl. You broke her heart. Josh sniggered. She broke my heart too, he sighed dramatically. Josh placed his hand on his forehead for the extra effect. Yuta laughed and glanced at Ronald. At least she's free for you to date. Ronald nodded and gave him a cheeky grin. Yeah, I was there when they broke up. Olivia was the one who did it. She even had the moxie to slap him. It was killer diller, he explained, chuckling. Josh clenched his fists as he seemed to want to keep that a secret, although he surprisingly didn't respond or call that statement false. Ronald tossed the ball to Carter while the others laughed at Josh. What about you, Casper? He slyly joked, referring to Carter's ghost white hair. Who's your secret love? Carter rolled his eyes as he caught the ball. Don't like any girl here, he said, glimpsing at Yuta with a flustered face. Yuta believed Carter when he said that. He noticed that Carter would never gawk at Jessica or Olivia when they were with them, the same way the other boys in their class does. Carter was the type of guy who focused on more important matters such as school before romance. Josh violently kicked Carter's leg. Choose one. It's not that hard, he exclaimed, although the corners of his lips were curved in a tiny grin, enjoying this conversation. Carter gripped his ankle in pain and huffed. Why, when I said I don't like the girls here, that doesn't mean I don't like any girls. Of course I love girls. Dames, broads, dillies, they are beautiful. I love 'em, he awkwardly stated, crossing his arms and puffing his chest outwards. He scanned the boys' expressions to make sure they understood his comment. Ronald gave Carter an eccentric look suggesting he was weirded out. Okay, which girl? Carter shrugged and forced himself to appear nonchalant about the whole situation, but Yuta could tell otherwise from the way his legs bounced anxiously. All girls. I like every girl. Lots of girls. I love girls, he insisted, not realizing he was the one making himself look bizarre. Josh rubbed his temples, frustrated with Carter's nonsensical answer. The way you're saying it makes me believe you don't like girls. Weren't you listening to what I said? I love girls, Carter protested, taking Josh's sarcastic comment seriously. He glanced at Yuta for assistance. Right, Yuta? Yuta shot him a look of uncertainty. Fine. I like Jessica, I suppose, Carter sighed, slumping in his chair and pursing his lips. Thank you. It wasn't that difficult now, was it? Josh huffed, rolling his eyes at Carter. Carter wasn't finished yet, as he straightened his back and scrutinized the boys sternly. He was determined to make sure they knew that he fancies girls. But I hope you all know that I like girls. We get it. They all cried in unison. The boys exchanged glances and laughed at their synchronization, except Carter, who slumped in his chair. Carter grunted in dismay and chucked the ball harshly at Josh. It's your turn, which wacky, he grouchily muttered. Yuta laughed at Carter's irritation and leaned forward to pat his knees reassuringly. Josh paused to think for a moment. Honestly, no one at the moment. I just broke up with Olivia, he answered, shrugging. Carter immediately pointed his finger at Josh. Ha! You like no girls, that means you like boys. He suddenly spurted. Everyone gave Carter a look of bewilderment, and they exchanged uneasy glances between each other. Where the hell did you get that queer logic from? Josh spat, his green eyes flaring. Carter seemed to be making the embarrassment worse for himself, so he sunk in his seat and averted his gaze. If you had to choose, Josh. Who? Jimmy queried, directing the conversation to a less uncomfortable place. Josh pondered the question. Olive. As soon as the name left his mouth, he widened his eyes in surprise. The other boys shared the same stunned and soundless expression. Josh frantically spun his head. No, I meant Jessica. Everyone here seems to like Jessica, I would choose her. The school bell rang at that moment, and Josh sighed with relief, being saved from the humiliation that would have come next. Yuta jumped up and followed his friends to the middle of the court where Mr. Stevenson called them. As they gathered, Mr. Stevenson applauded them and allowed them to leave, after a quick pep talk, of course. The group watched their teacher walk across the court and pack his belongings before they swiftly huddled together. Since we have to go to the leadership club with Stevenson after school today, we can't discuss anything. Jimmy, quickly inform us about the test we're going to have to do on the teacher suspects, Yuta said, gesturing towards the stunted boy. Jimmy sighed and looked down at his sneakers. I'm going to be completely honest with y'all, he began in a disappointed voice. I got nothing. Jessica gasped while the others groaned. Why not? What happened? She frenziedly asked, tucking blonde strands behind her ear. The brain of the group shrugged. I couldn't think of anything logical, and my head started to ache, Jimmy explained truthfully. Josh rolled his eyes and viciously groaned. Who cares about your damn head? The thing is more important, he hissed. No, we need Jimmy's brain, Josh. You wouldn't understand since your skull is so thick, Carter said, shaking his head at Josh. You did a lot for us, Jimmy. Thanks for being honest. Josh gaped at him but didn't respond with a curt remark. Seems like the collaboration task worked, Yuta thought. Jimmy nodded and looked around the group with a serious expression. Honestly, I think we shouldn't test the teachers at all, he commented, snapping his suspenders with his hands. What? Are you stupid? The teachers were our main suspects yesterday. Olivia gasped, rubbing her right palm harshly. Yuta learned from Carter the other day that whenever they were talking or thinking about the paranormal activity, their palms would ache. That only intrigued him more, and made him want to solve the mystery as quickly as possible. I know, but do you really want to go up to McGurdy or Briggs to try and trick them? Their wrath would be scarier than the paranormal activity, Jimmy pointed out, his hazel eyes wide with terror at the simple thought. The thing, Ronald corrected in a quiet voice, gesturing towards Mr. Stevenson. Thankfully, their teacher was still sitting on the bleachers across the court, packing his bags. Yuta squinted to where Mr. Stevenson was sitting. His mouth looked like it was softly shifting up and down as if he was talking to someone, but there was no one sitting beside him. Yuta rubbed his eyes, brushing it off as the illusion of distance. So what do? We have no solid leads, Yuta pointed out, turning to face the group. The school was a good guess, but it's too vague. How exactly would the school be producing the thing if it's a building? Everyone sighed with dismay, agreeing with Yuta's comment. Damn it, Carter grunted. We're done for, he hopelessly said, resting his head on Yuta's shoulder. Yuta ruffled his hair consolingly, hoping it would give him the reassurance he needed. Oh, Jimmy exclaimed, his head jolting up. Everyone instantly turned to look at the boy, and their eyes were already lit up because they knew Jimmy had figured something out. Yuta? Yeah, right. How can the school produce the thing if it's a building? Well, what do we know about Willesden? He inquired, the corners of his lips curved into a grin. Josh slammed his forehead with his palm. Don't question us, dolt. Just tell us. He angrily snapped. Jimmy rolled his eyes, annoyed that Josh ruined his dramatic reveal. The answer is, we know that Willesden was built in the 15th century. What if the answer is something historic? What if the thing has been occurring for years because of this school? Barbara placed her hands on her hips and shook her head. But that doesn't make sense. We've been at this school for 2 years and it only started happening to us now. Jimmy shrugged. True. However, it's the only plausible lead we have right now. And I think it's worth the try. Carter raised an eyebrow. What exactly are we going to do? He inquired, uncrossing his arms. Jimmy smirked, eyeing his friends with a smug expression. Study some books in the library. I'm sure there will be some hints about Willesden's history. Before the students had time to jump up and down with excitement, Mr. Stevenson suddenly appeared behind them. The library. I see you kiddos are scholars too. That's excellent. Willesden needs well-rounded and balanced leaders, he said proudly. The group nodded in agreement and crossed their fingers, hoping that was all Mr. Stevenson heard. Well, I'll see you folks after school. He exclaimed brightly. Mr. Stevenson, we already did a lot of leadership activities. Is it possible to not have a meeting today? Yuta hopefully asked, peering up at him with kind eyes. Mr. Stevenson laughed and gently shook his head. You lot are Willesden's first leaders, and there's still a lot of training I must put you through. Don't worry, there is loads of time for us to progress. I can't wait to see how this year unfolds.